Hey guys, Argent here with another episode of A Brief Political History of Canada. I know this will probably be about an hour or a bit over an hour, but I'm compressing 200 years of political development into a couple um, videos into like an hour. So we have the post-war period. So this is dominated by Louis Saint Laurent, obviously a Quebecer. As you can see, Liberals continue to win all the seats in Quebec, and the Conservatives do comparatively better in Ontario. Um, let's see here. So that was a disastrous election for the Tories. The Tories just tend to suck. They very rarely do well at all. Um, they almost fall as low as the CCF. It's not uncommon for the Liberals to get well over 40% of the vote. Then we have the 1950s, where we have our first conservative government since World War II in the form of Diefenbaker, also known as Dief the Chief, who's the leader of the now Progressive Conservative Party, with its ideology of progressive conservatism or red Toryism. I'll have to do something about red Toryism at some point. Um, Basically, it's kind of like it's basically the same thing as liberalism. It's basically just liberalism, and which means there's no difference between these two parties. I haven't been able to find one other than like a couple minor issues, and that the Tories just being slightly slower to adopt the latest left-wing trend. So this is a minority government for Deef. Um, he manages to sweep Ontario, win no seats in Quebec. So a minority government is one party doesn't have a majority, and yeah, so social credit continues to, and the CCF continue to dominate their respective parts of the prairies. Like I said, social credit is big in Alberta and to some extent BC, but in kind of the prairie provinces, the poorer ones, the CCF dominates. So we have another election the next year, and Deef manages to win a large majority. Um, Very strange. This was at the time the largest majority in Canadian history. Um, the Social Credit Party ceased to exist in this election. Deef's success is in part managing to incorporate it and win a lot of votes from the CCF. The CCF is basically takes a licking that it's going to have a lot of trouble recovering from. The Liberals, though, are down, but they'll come back. Deef succeeds in winning a second majority government. Um, the loss by the CCF was so great that it basically reformed as the New Democratic Party, um, which is fairly similar, but it's less centered in the prairie provinces. It has a broader appeal. It is formed by the merger of the CCF, which, as we went over, lost most of its seats, and the Canadian Labour Congress, which is basically unions throughout Canada. So it went from being kind of a rural, prairie-based party to just be a working-class party. So it gained support all over Canada. Particularly, it gained a lot of support in British Columbia, where it remains a strong force to this day. In most of Western Canada, the Liberal Party eventually, around this time, ceases to exist, and we will just have Conservative versus NDP. Eastern Canada, the NDP is not nearly as strong a force. And then you have Social Credit randomly winning a bunch of seats in Quebec, but Quebec are a bunch of Randys, and their voting doesn't make a lot of sense. So we have Tommy Douglas. I think Tommy Douglas he was voted the greatest Canadian for inventing Medicare. And then we have Lester B. Pearson. So the next election, we have a minority government um, of Lester B. Pearson, who manages to win back and finally dethrones Deef the Chief, who was really the only conservative until we get to Mulroney to effectively mount an opposition to the Liberal Party. Social Credit manages to hold on to a bunch of seats in Quebec randomly, and the New Democratic Party has managed to pick up seats and really become the third force in Canadian politics. Then we have the election of 1965. Liberals managed to just win a majority. We have another random social credit party, which is very strange. But basically, by this point in time, we have the Liberal Party, the Progressive Conservative Party, and the New Democratic Party. And now we have the Age of Trudeau, who's really the man who ruined Canada. He's the one who brought in all the human rights legislation. He's the one who brought in multiculturalism, mass immigration. He massively increased the debt. He massively changed Canadian politics. He single-handedly basically destroyed anything that was conservative or identitarian about Canada, and blended it into a he just blended it into a mess. I despise the man. I consider him the worst leader Canada's ever had, and his son may be the next prime minister, who's even worse than him. Yeah, so basically, Trudeau is kind of like a far-right guy. He's kind of like Canada's Barack Obama. Imagine if Barack Obama ran during the 60s, though, and implemented everything he supports today during the 60s. That's how much Trudeau changed Canada. And the Conservatives are completely incapable of mounting any sort of opposition to him. To some extent, the NDP almost does a better job. As you can see, though, Trudeau, being a French Canadian, basically wins all of Quebec seats. By this point, the social credit movement has collapsed, and Alberta and the prairies largely vote Tory, as does Ontario. Once again, we're seeing the ethnic breakdown of Canada. Quebec tends to, because Quebec is the most homogenous province, it tends to vote entirely in one direction, and it can make or break a party very easily. So then we had the election of 1994, just Trudeau continuing to clean up. They call it Trudeaumania because of how dominant he was in Canadian politics. Joe Clark briefly managed to form a minority government, which he screwed up because he held a vote when he knew he could lose. And the Social Credit Party, which was also right-wing, could have helped him, but he refused to talk to them. Then Trudeau came back and won another majority government. The NDP are gradually picking up steam, and social credit at this point ceases to exist. And this brings an end to the Age of Trudeau. This brings an end to the dramatic and radical change Canadian society has undergone. During this time period, we had the FLQ crisis, where separatists in Quebec start committing really, frankly, lame terrorist attacks, and there's a growing movement within Quebec for it to secede. They voted Liberal during the Trudeau years because Trudeau promised a multicultural society in which Quebec would have more influence. But that didn't really materialize to the degree that they wanted, and bilingualism wasn't good enough for them. So they voted for sorry, I just went blank from it. Where is Joe Clark from, anyways? Oh, he is from Alberta. Okay, that's weird. He doesn't act like an Albertan. Yeah, so we had that happen in Quebec. So Quebec is currently voting 100% for the Liberals because they want bilingualism, they want multiculturalism, and Trudeau tried to bring in a national energy program. Around this time, oil was discovered in Alberta and eventually in Saskatchewan, and the Liberals basically were going to build a pipeline from Alberta to Quebec to bring in cheap subsidized oil to eastern Canada. This was during the oil blockade and the energy crisis, and this is around the time Alberta became such a wealthy province. And basically, Trudeau is going to redistribute that wealth to the rest of Canada, and Alberta said fuck that, and they haven't voted for the Liberals since. Nor have Saskatchewan or Manitoba, really. The NDP still do okay there, but no, they mainly vote PC. So around this time, we have that. So the Conservatives have picked up a lot of steam in Western Canada, and Quebec has really gone for the Liberals. Trudeau fails to deliver, though, on everything he promised, and he's slowly turning Canada into a hellhole. So we have the election of 1984, where we have Brian Mulroney, who basically purges the last couple remaining social conservatives from the party and abandons all principles in favor of a neoliberal Reaganomic-esque shock thing in which most of Canada's crown corporations are privatized, taxes and government spending are dramatically cut, and yet he runs up the one of the largest debts in Canadian history. Because like most center-right politicians, he doesn't he's unwilling to cut public spending as much as taxes. So he massively cut taxes without really reducing spending enough, and that left a massive budget deficit. He also strongly supported multiculturalism. He was a Irish guy from Quebec, so he was a Quebecer. He's an Anglo-Francophone, if that makes any sense. So he was a Quebecer. He was a wealthy businessman. Um, so Mulroney, basically also just because John Turner was fucking lame and no one liked him. Um, yeah, it was a sweep. Quebec during this time period briefly voted conservative because Trudeau hadn't delivered on anything. Mulroney promised Quebec the sun and the stars. He said that, oh, I'll give you everything. We'll implement all this shit to make Canada more multicultural. We'll give you everything you want. We'll make all your dreams come true. And he said that to every province in Canada. So the western provinces were really pissed off because that whole national energy program thing and just the general centralizing tendency of the Liberal Party didn't go well with their independence. They saw the Liberals as being really a Quebec-centered party, and them all being English-speaking. Keep in mind, in like Alberta, you'll have less than 1% of the population who speaks French, and yet they're being forced to learn French in the schools, which they'll never use. Um, so they won there. They swept Western Canada, and Quebec thought that Mulroney would deliver on all his promises, which led to the largest majority in Canadian history. Um, the in the subsequent election, the Conservatives lost a bit of the vote, but not really that much of it. And as you can see, the NDP picked up a lot of seats, particularly in the West. Um, I'll get into detail about this a bit more once Canada's 9/11 happens, as I like to call it. But basically, there was a feeling that Mulroney had sold out entirely to Quebec interests, and that the Conservative Party didn't care about the West, that they were just a bunch of Eastern businessmen who were willing to sell out Western Canada for a nickel, that they had no principles, that they didn't care about the people, and that they were just kind of corporate suits. Something that would prove to be 100% accurate when Mulroney was basically exposed as a corrupt money grubber who he just sucked. He was terrible. He was a neoliberal. Um, he never saw a way of selling out Canada economically or internationally that he didn't like. And I'm not saying the Liberals are any better. The Liberals are worse. But he was just this neoliberal, socially progressive, cut taxes but not cut government guy. So Western Canada fucking hated him near the end. Because he didn't give a shit about them. Quebec still liked him though, and Ontario was ambivalent about him. So, we had the election of 1988, where Mulroney basically promised everything. So then we have a series of referendums. We have the Charlottetown Accords, and we also had the Meech Lake Accords, which I don't really want to go into. Basically, it was a bunch of public. It was a bunch of referendums that would